We are in Daniel 7 tonight as we try to plow through Daniel. And now is when Daniel starts to get hard and complicated. That's not as hard as complicated as what Peter's trying to do, but it's still hard and complicated. And tonight, since it was in the evening meeting and we get more guests, I titled this Monsters from the Id, which of course most of you will remember from Forbidden Planet when Morbius and the others used the Krell brain magnifier and the monsters come out of their subconscious minds. I think that that's an awful lot of what's going on here in Daniel 7, although it isn't a Krell brain enhancer that's at work here. It's still monsters from the subconscious of the human race that are being pointed to. So let's look at Daniel 7, and the first thing we'll do is walk through the chapter, read it, and give an exposition of it, get all this complicated information in front of us, and then we'll go back and I'll try to take you through the standard interpretations, and then of course the brand new and totally unheard of interpretation that I'll suggest. Not really. Okay, context. Verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following beginning of it, or summary of it. First year of Belshazzar. This would have been while Belshazzar was pro-rex, standing in for his father Nabonidus, who was away doing his thing in Saudi Arabia. Why do these visions come now? Well, we have already seen in Daniel 5 that Belshazzar is the Pharaoh who knows not Joseph. Belshazzar has no interest in Daniel. We know from Babylonian history, from the Chronicles, that after Nebuchadnezzar came Evil-Merodach, who continued to favor the Jews, but he was overthrown by Neriglissar. And Neriglissar assassinated him, and apparently at that point removed those who had been close to the direct lineage of Nebuchadnezzar. And now Nabonidus comes from him, and then Belshazzar is his son. So this line of rulers, although they are related to Nebuchadnezzar, have not been continuing Nebuchadnezzar's policies. In fact, they're running Babylon into the ground, and as we said before, when Cyrus took the city of Babylon, he was pretty much welcomed as a deliverer more than resisted as a conqueror, because people were so tired of the oppression of their kings, or the misbehavior of their kings. So this vision comes in the first year of Belshazzar. The context would seem to be things are not going as well for the Jews as they had been before. So Daniel is distressed. We'll find later on the two visions that come in the reign of Cyrus come particularly for those reasons. In the first year of Cyrus, Daniel is concerned because the 70 weeks are up, and so now it's time to get back in the land, and so God grants him a vision. And then in the third year of Cyrus, the opposition has arisen, and the building project on the temple is stopped, and Daniel is distressed and fasts for 3 weeks. Then he's granted a vision of the distresses to come. Well, now, Belshazzar is king. Belshazzar is not favorable to God's people, and Daniel is given a vision that is comforting. And the vision basically says, yep, things are going to be bad for quite a while, but eventually judgment will be passed on behalf of the saints of the Most High. So look down the future and be encouraged. That would be the gist of the vision. That seems to be why it happens, when it happens. So now, what is the vision? Verses 2 to 8, the first part. Daniel says, or Daniel relates, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts were coming out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion with wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was also given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, who's they? Arise, devour much meat. And after this I kept looking, and behold, another one, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. And the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And after this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying, extremely strong, and had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And then while I was contemplating the horns, Behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled up by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. Okay, let's get these facts before us. He sees the ocean. Imagine, well, you see it out here. A cloudy day, so the ocean is black, gray, ripply, threatening. 4 winds coursing across the ocean, stirring it up. And then the first monster comes out. It's a lion with the wings of an eagle. And he looks at it, and then all of a sudden the lion turns into a man. Then up comes a thing that's like a bear. It's not a lion with wings, it's like a lion with wings of an eagle. The second one is like a bear. And it's raised up on one side, which seems to mean the bear is stalking along. You know, imagine a bear with 2 feet down and 2 feet up, moving along, so it's raised up and it's moving forward. That seems to be the idea of being raised up on one side. There may be a slight other meaning to it. And 3 ribs were in its mouth, or perhaps 3 tusks, if it's been killing out of the mouth of another animal. And it means it's been eating something. And then they say to it, he hears voices say, "Go to it, man, arise, eat much meat." Then he keeps looking, and then out of the water comes a leopard, something like a leopard, that has 4 wings on its back and it has 4 heads, and it's given dominion. Now, I don't know how you see this in a vision, but in the vision he sees it being given dominion somehow. And then he sees a 4th beast, and he doesn't see any characteristics. It's not like a lion, it's not like a bear. In fact, it doesn't have a face at all. It's faceless and it's formless. All he sees are horns and feet. He sees big iron teeth, and he sees horns, and he sees its feet trampling things down, and that's it. That's all he sees. And the rest of it is out of view. Then he looks at the horns, and all of a sudden a little horn comes up, but it has a face. The beast itself, if it has a face, it's hidden from view, but the face that shows up and is visible to Daniel is the face of this little horn. So the face of the beast that's visible to Daniel is that of the little horn. The face of the beast itself is out of view. This is real important to understanding this prophecy, because he doesn't see what the beast looks like. Nor do we in the book of Daniel. All we see is the little horn, which is part of the beast. It has a face, and he sees that. That's what we see. The little horn, it has eyes like the eyes of a man. It has a face. The only face of the beast that is visible is that of the little horn. And it has eyes and it has a mouth. Now, we have Judgment Day. We can pretty much know already that these 4 animals correspond to the 4 plus 1 aspects of the statue of the Restoration era. The gold, silver, bronze, iron, and terracotta statue that we looked at. And now we have lion, bear, leopard, monster, and little horn sequence here, and the statue, which is the tabernacle that God dwells in during this period of time, is replaced by the kingdom of God, and now we have the same sequence. The monster-like things that keep coming up out of the ocean are now replaced by the man, or one who is like a man. The same sequence takes place. So now we have Judgment Day, and the monster time is moved out of history. The monster phase is about to be brought to an end, at least in a preliminary way. Verse 9, I kept looking until thrones were set up. So it's Judgment Day. They are setting up all the thrones for the court. And the Ancient of Days came and took his seat. His vesture was like white snow. The hair on his head was pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. Well, this is a chariot throne. It has wheels. And think back to Ezekiel chapter 1. There's that chariot throne that's like fire, and it has flames, and it has wheels. And if we go back to Chronicles, we find that the Ark of the Covenant, which is the throne of God, is called the chariot. And it has 2 cherubim on it, and then 2 other cherubim standing next to it, for 4 cherubim altogether. And here, that's what this is. The Ancient of Days comes in on his 4-cherub throne with his wheels. And a river of fire was flowing and coming out before him. And then that's identified. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. So first of all, he sees what looks like a river of fire in front of the throne of God, and he takes another look, and there's seraphim. There are myriads and myriads and thousands of angels. That's what the fire is. They're seraphim, the flaming angels of God, and they're all standing before him. So now, everybody's arrived, the court sits, and the books are opened up. The glory cloud has arrived, and of course, we study glory cloud phenomena in Ezekiel or anywhere else. This is all pretty standard stuff. We're not so surprised at this if we become familiar with glory cloud imagery in the Bible. The angels are all there, and so Daniel keeps looking. The books are opened up. Now something's going to happen. I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words that the horn was speaking. So this horn is running its mouth the whole time. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. So the first thing that Daniel notices is the whole time that they've been moving in the chairs, and the Lord comes in on his chariot, and the chariot parks, and the Lord takes his seat, and all the angels array around him. The whole time that's been going on, over here, the little horn's been making these big boasts, and talking, and carrying on, and making noise, and yelling, and shaking his fist. And so the first thing that happens is they wipe him out. The little horn is gone. But now there are these other beasts, and apparently the other beasts are still hanging around there on the side of the seashore, and their dominion is taken away, but they are allowed to live a somewhat longer period of time, even though judicially speaking, they no longer rule the world. Now again, this isn't too hard. Remember, the vision in chapter 2 is God has given the world to the empires from Nebuchadnezzar to Jesus. And that statue of a man is the tabernacle of God for this period of time. God and his people will dwell inside these empires. And then they'll come to an end. So this is the end, the official end. But now, the Roman Empire continued to exist in the world, and actually the Persian Empire continued to exist, and Greece still exists today, and we still have nations today, so they continue to live, but in terms of the restoration covenant, that covenant comes to an end, the dominion of that time comes to an end. Well, the dominion of that world is broken off. Where does it go? Well, the courtroom scene continues, verses 13 and 14. I kept looking. Daniel just kind of keeps looking here. I kept looking, and I kept looking. In the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. So we've had things that were like monsters. Now we have one like a son of man. And he comes, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given the dominion. So that's where the dominion goes. Glory and the kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. His kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. So this is it, the climax of history. The kingdom that's established now will go forever. Now, a couple of things here. If we were looking at the New Testament, and I think most of you are aware of this, many times in the New Testament where Jesus says, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, it's not referring to him coming to the earth. It's referring to him coming to the Ancient of Days. It's a quotation from this. So whenever in Matthew or Mark, other places, the gospel writers have Jesus saying, you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, or coming to the Ancient of Days. If it's a quotation from this passage, it's a picture of the ascension. And that's what this is. Jesus ascends to heaven, and he comes before God the Father, and he's given the kingdom. If we were to take the time to read Revelation chapter 4 and 5, we would see this. That's all pictured there in detail. The court in heaven is sat, the book is sealed, no one can open it, and then they see the Lamb come forward, he comes up to the throne. It's the same picture. So this is the ascension. It is at the ascension of Christ, and by the way, not in AD 70, that Christ is given the dominion of all these kingdoms. So let's get the sequence. The little horn has been broken off by this time. The dominion of all the empires, this entire imperial stage of history from Nebuchadnezzar to Jesus, that dominion, the world dominion, is given to Jesus at his ascension. He becomes King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, Daniel, verse 15, says, "As for me, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me." This is important. He stresses this more than once. For some reason, Daniel is upset by what he sees. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think so. I mean, he's already been told that the course of world history is going to be that the world empires. It's not going to be Israel anymore. It's going to be the world empires. It's going to be Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and Darius and their governors. That's going to be how God works in the world during this period of time. And he knows that, and now he sees it's going to come to an end. Why is he so upset? Well, we'll have to answer that. But I want to call attention to it now. We have the first interpretive scene here, verses 15 to 18. Verse 16, "I approached one of those who were standing by." This is the angelic interpreter. If you start studying the visions and dreams in the Bible, especially in this period in history, you'll find there's always an angelic interpreter who's standing by, who explains what's going on. "So I approached one of those who was standing by, one of those flaming angels, and began asking him the truth concerning all this stuff. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. And this is it. These great beasts which are four kings who will arise from the earth. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come." That's it. That is the big picture. Now we can go into the details, but it's useful to know that a true interpretation of this, we don't have to know all the details. And let me just make an application there. We can understand the gospel and we can understand the rudimentary truths of the Christian religion and the heart of it and the essence of it, and we can live good Christian lives without knowing all the details that are in the Bible. But the details are also there. So it's perfectly true to say what this means is the beasts are four kings, and then we'll have to say these are actually kingdoms, not actually kings, because that's obvious. Four kingdoms that come up from the earth, but the saints receive the kingdom and they possess the kingdom, and that's it. That's the good news. That's it. But now we can also look at the details. What you need to know is that, the gospel. If you want to grow, let's get the details down. So Daniel asks for a little bit more. Verse 19. "Then I desired to know the truth concerning the fourth beast, which was different from the others. It was faceless and shapeless, exceedingly dreadful, with teeth of iron and claws of bronze." Now we see claws of bronze, "which devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, namely the horn that had eyes and a mouth, that was uttering great things, and that was bigger than its associates." It looked bigger. It was larger in appearance. It doesn't mean it really was larger. It says it was larger in appearance. Now I'm going to suggest to you that the little horn looked larger to Daniel because it was closer to Daniel. Now I don't know how this vision worked, but what he's saying is when I looked at it, that little horn that ate up 3 of the other horns looked larger than the rest. He doesn't say it was larger. And I think there's a reason for that. In fact, I know there's a reason for it because it's the Word of God, but I think I can tell you what the reason is. That's what I mean. Verse 21, "I kept looking." So he's looking some more. This is going on. It's in time. "And that horn was waging war with the saints, and it was overpowering them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom." So we almost have a refrain here. Judgment was passed on behalf of the saints, and the saints took the kingdom. Now we get the interpretation of this question. "Then he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of the kingdom 10 kings will arise." Well, now, are they kings? We've already seen that the 4 beasts are 4 kings, but then we were told they were 4 kingdoms. Now we're told out of the kingdom 10 kings will arise, but there are probably 10 kingdoms as well. There's a fluidity in the Aramaic language here, because this is still in Aramaic, not Hebrew. These are probably 10 kingdoms rather than kings. They will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones. And he will subdue 3 kings, or 3 kingdoms. And he will speak out against the Most High, and wear down the saints of the highest ones. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law. That's not a good translation. And they, the saints, will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But, here's the good news again. The court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will obey and serve him, serve and obey him. At this point, the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So again, we're told that Daniel was upset. I hope we have refreshed ourselves on what's in this chapter. I know you've read it before, probably several times, and thought about it, but now we have it in mind. Let's see if we can unpack some of it. Interpretations. Number 1, going back to the beginning, A, the 4 winds and the sea. Daniel sees the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. There are basically 2 kinds of interpretations of that. One, the most common, is that the great sea simply represents the world, and the 4 winds of heaven, or 4 spirits. In Hebrew, wind and spirit is the same word. Breath, wind, spirit, represent angels. Angels are working with God. They're manipulating history. They're stirring up the Gentile world, the great sea, and out of this comes these 4 beasts. So angels working for God are bringing this to pass. Well, we can live with that interpretation, but I think that there is something far more specific and important to bear in mind. And that is that the 4 winds are not really angels, they're God's people. And Zechariah identifies them as such in a passage that seems to be describing exactly this. Zechariah chapter 1, you can flip over and look if you want, or listen. In Zechariah chapter 1, the first vision, Zechariah sees a low place among myrtle trees, and he sees horses in there. And he asks, what are these? And the angel says that the Lord has sent these horses out to patrol the earth, and the earth is peaceful and quiet. We don't know exactly who or what these horses are, and there's an ambiguity in the vision as to who they are. But in chapter 6, those horses go riding out to take conquest to the world. And in view of what happens in these visions, at the end of the vision, they would seem to be the people of God. Now in chapter 2 of Zechariah, in the 3rd vision, Zechariah is told to look, and he sees someone going out to measure Jerusalem. And in verse 4, the man who is going to measure Jerusalem, or Zechariah more likely, is told, Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls because of the multitude of men and cattle within it. Because, declares the Lord, I will be a wall of fire around it, and I will be her glory in the midst. So the greatness and glory of Jerusalem after the exile, when they come back, despite appearances, the true spiritual glory of it will be so much that Jerusalem will be spread out without walls. Now, as a matter of fact, in Nehemiah they build the walls. And the walls are a big deal in Nehemiah. So what does this mean to say Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls? Well, I think it's explained as we go. Verse 6, Ho there, flee from the land of the north, declares the Lord, for I have spread you out as the 4 winds of heaven. Ho Zion, escape you who are living with daughter Babylon. Well, Babylon doesn't exist anymore when this vision comes. Persia is what exists. So how do you flee Babylon? I think that we have to take this as spiritual separation. As a matter of fact, the Jews remain spread out throughout the world. Some come back to Jerusalem, but most of them remain spread out. And God says, I have spread you out all over the world. So there is one sense in which Jerusalem exists throughout the world wherever God's people are, but God's people have to separate from daughter Babylon and become part of daughter Zion wherever they are. The main thing that I want to point to here is, there may be some other nuance of that Peter could give us, is that it says, I have spread you out as the four winds of heaven. Now, that means that the Jews are the four winds of heaven. They're spread out all over the world, and wherever they are zephyrs off the great breeze. The Holy Spirit is the great wind, and we are all zephyrs off the great wind. We're told that in John. The wind blows where it lists, and you hear the sound thereof. So is every one who is born by the Spirit. It doesn't say, so is the Spirit of God. The wind blows where it lists, and you hear the sound thereof, but you don't see it. It doesn't say that's what the Spirit of God is like. It says that's what we are like, because we are born by the Spirit. The idea here seems to be the same thing. God's people are spread out in the world as the four winds of heaven. Now we know from Esther, and we know from Zechariah and other places, that what are they going to do as the four winds of heaven? They're supposed to bear witness everywhere they go. That's why they're spread out, so that they can engage in witness bearing. Well, now we come down to the end of Zechariah's visions as the sun comes up in the morning, and what do we see? Chariots. Chariots drawn by horses. And in verse 4, the angelic interpreter is asked, what are these? In verse 5, the angel answered and said to me, these are the four winds of heaven, who go forth after standing before the master of all the earth. Well, who's been standing before the master of all the earth in these visions? Joshua and Zerubbabel, the representatives of the people. And Joshua's sins have been cleansed, and Zerubbabel has had 49 pipes of Holy Spirit oil descend on him. The Spirit is poured out on him and on the high priest as representatives of the people. And so that all that spiritual energy is being, once the vision means this, once you rebuild the temple and God comes to be back into it, then the oil is going to come from the trees down the two branches of Haggai and Zechariah, and it's going to come down on the priest and the king and flow out to the people, and it's going to be 49 channels of oil from heaven. You want to talk about messianic anointment. A Messiah is someone that's anointed with oil. They've got a 49-fold messianic anointment upon the people of God after the exile. This is the first outpouring of the Holy Spirit. The greater outpouring at Pentecost, this is a preliminary one. Now the Holy Spirit is poured out on all the people here, and so as the sun comes up, they ride forth as the four winds of heaven, and they conquer the north country, and they pacify things, and they go out and stir up the world. Remember in chapter 1, it's an unfortunate thing when the horses come back and they say, we have patrolled the earth, and behold, the earth is peaceful and quiet. And remember Peter was saying this morning, Zechariah views that as something to grieve about. We don't want the world to be peaceful and quiet. The gospel goes forth to stir things up, to shake people up out of their dogmatic slumbers so that they get saved. So now the Spirit is poured out, and people are made into the four winds, and the four winds go riding forth, and they stir up the world. Now go back to Daniel. What happens when the saints go out and they stir up the great Gentile sea? What happens when the gospel goes forth into the world and it stirs up the world and the witness goes forth? Well, what's happened in Daniel so far? They bore witness to Christ, and they threw him in the lion's den. They bore witness to Christ, and they threw him in the fiery furnace. They bore witness to Christ, and the new kings came and sent him out of town. Didn't acknowledge him anymore. When you bear faithful witness, the result is monsters come up out of the sea. That is what makes Daniel upset. And we have to come to grips with that. If you take the gospel message out to the world, it produces monsters out of the sea. Now there's a specific reason why it produces monsters out of the sea. And we should be real happy that it produces monsters out of the sea. But you know, if you haven't thought about that before, it probably makes you nervous. You think, gee, Don't know if I want to be an evangelist if it's going to produce monsters, but it does. I will reflect on that when we get back down to it, but here I want as much as I can to nail this down, that the four winds of heaven are the saints, stirring up the Gentile sea. And now the beasts come out of the sea. Okay, we'll come back to that, the monsters from the id, and where they come from. Now let's continue with the interpretation. Four beasts come up. Who are they? One interpretation is they're Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. That has been advocated by many conservative interpreters through the centuries. As I said the other day, we now know that there was no Median empire between Babylon and Persia. The Persians had completely conquered the Medes before they took Babylon. You can't get a Median empire in there. Therefore, these four empires are Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Now, if you're a liberal, you don't want to admit that it's Rome because you want to think Daniel was written during the Greek era and doesn't contain any prophecies, and it's all backdated and it's all fake. So the liberals never admit that it's Rome. But nowadays, almost all conservative expositors will say the Fourth Empire is Rome, and I see no reason to question that. I don't know of any conservative evangelical interpreters now who don't take it that way. Because, as I say, modern research has shown there was no Median empire in between Babylon and Persia, so it just won't work. That alternative has been swept away by research. Four empires. Let's look at them. The first one's like a lion has wings of an eagle. That's Babylon. And then it's lifted up from the ground, the wings are plucked off, and it stands on its 2 feet like a man, and the human mind was given to it. What do you think that refers to? The conversion of Nebuchadnezzar. I think that's true. Calvin wants to say, Calvin doesn't believe Nebuchadnezzar was really converted, so he doesn't want to take that interpretation. So what Calvin says is, no, what that means is that after the Persians came and plucked the wings off the Babylonian Empire, then it ceased to be a monster and it was just a man, and now the monster was Persia. But I don't really think that works. It seems to me in context of Daniel, especially the business of the human heart being given to it, points right back to Nebuchadnezzar turns into a beast for 7 years and then turns back into a man in his behavior and is given the mind of a man. It certainly seems to me. Plus it says that Nebuchadnezzar's hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and this says the eagle's wings were plucked off. Sure looks like Nebuchadnezzar to me, so I think that's who it is. In fact, I know that's who it is. I think that's who it is. I think that's what we're supposed to think in context of Daniel. Second beast, Medo-Persia, raised up on one side. Usually that's made to say that, well, it was really a Medo-Persian empire, but the Persians were bigger than the Medes at this point, so it's raised up on one side. That might be true, or it might just be the idea that this bear is stalking along, and right at the moment one side is higher than the other. And it's already started to eat something, and it's got 3, which I think in context means several ribs or tusks or teeth in its mouth of another animal. And the angels say, arise and devour much meat. A couple of possibilities there. One is that they were just encouraged to keep conquering. A second possibility is that this predicts the events in the book of Esther, when you do find an attempt by the wicked to devour the people of God, but it's turned around and the people of God devour them. And this consuming idea would come up there, particularly since the events in Esther are celebrated by the Feast of Purim, and feasts and eating is a major theme in Esther. The third possibility is that the angels are leading the Persians into a trap. Devour much meat means attack Greece, which Darius tried to do, and then Xerxes tried to do, and it didn't work, and the Persians were frustrated in it. One thing that seems to be clear is that there's an idea of continual conquest. This is a bear-like thing that's on the march, and it's going to conquer a lot. Specifically what it refers to, I'm not sure. Those are your options. Maybe more. Then we come to something that to me is very interesting. I don't know what to do with. That's the Greek Empire. It's like a leopard. It has 4 wings and it has 4 heads. What does that remind you of? The cherubim. The cherubim don't quite have 4 heads, but they almost have 4 heads. They have 4 faces, and those faces are kind of half heads off of one large head that's behind them all. And certainly the cherubim have some idea of dominion, and they all have 4 wings. Is Alexander in some sense a cherub? Is an idea of dominion being given here in that his wings are extended over the earth? Maybe that's it. I don't know. I lay it in front of you, and there may be no connection with the cherubim at all. But when you read 4 heads and 4 wings, that's what you think of. Well, that's what Ezekiel has been seeing. Exactly that. Now, this is Alexander. He's like a leopard, and he's given dominion. Dominion is stressed here. Of course, the others had something like dominion, but Alexander really had it over the whole world, more than the rest. Then we come to Rome. The 4th beast is dreadful and terrifying, extremely strong. It's not identified. It doesn't look like anything. Why? Well, part of the reason, I think, is that at this time in history, no one really knew who the Romans were. At this point in Daniel's history, Rome was just a town in Italy, been settled by survivors of the Trojan War who intermarried with the locals. And they weren't doing much. And it was far enough away to where an identification would not probably have meant anything. And so one isn't given. We're just told that it's the big monster beast is coming. There seems to be another reason, and that is that the Romans, unlike these other empires, they were not religious in the way the other empires were. They were not ritualistically religious around the worship of a particular god or set of gods. The Romans really were a political power. They had the lares and penates, the household gods, which everybody had in the ancient world, and they had the city god, and they had the Vestal Virgins, and they had the other things like that, but the main thing that they had was a political structure, and they operated in terms of politics and just raw power. And I think that the idea of something of a contrast between an idolatrous, mother-like kingdom where people are drawn into a feeling of security and warmth, or what Rushdoony calls an organic type of culture. I don't think that's original with him. That contrasts with a legalistic, masculine, stoic, political kind of kingdom like Rome was, which focused in on sheer power for its own sake. That's very nebulous, I know, but there is some reason why this beast is said to be different from the rest. And it tramples down the rest. It has 10 horns. Well, let's go on. Then we have the little horn that comes up among the Roman horns. Who is this? Well, of course, some have said, well, this is the Antichrist, and all of a sudden we're jumping to the end of history. And that the Roman civilization continues to be our civilization. Constantinople was the 2nd Rome. Moscow was the 3rd Rome. That's going that way. Going our way, the Holy Roman Empire with Charlemagne, and then the Holy Roman Empire became modern Europe and became in Vienna, and even we in the United States are still an extension of the Holy Roman Empire, so we're still in Rome, and someday soon, of course, the Antichrist is going to show up, coming out of our European culture, and so be an extension of Rome. Of course, as the decades go by, it's harder and harder to hold to that. The United States, our culture and civilization right now, it's interesting. It's the first time we've had a large Western culture and civilization that doesn't think of itself as Rome. You didn't grow up thinking that you were in Rome. But 300 years ago in Europe, people thought we're in Rome because they were in the Holy Roman Empire. And they still had some idea that they were an extension of Rome, and they claimed to be an extension of Rome. The papacy claims to be an extension of the spiritual power of Rome as transformed by the gospel. And the Holy Roman Emperor in Europe claimed to be part of Rome, and people thought, well, we're still in Rome. And of course, in the East they thought they were in Rome, and the Russians maintained that they were the true Rome. That's what Moscow is. It's the 3rd Rome. And of course, 3rd, after all, 1, 2, 3, that's going to be it, the 3rd and last Rome. But we live in a large Christian civilization, the Protestant civilization, that does not use the symbol of Rome as a defining point around itself. So God has finally kind of moved us past this point in history, and for any number of reasons, I don't think Daniel is all of a sudden popping down thousands of years into the future to talk about a future Antichrist here. The second interpretation that you will find in older commentaries, and also in Woodrow, of course, is that this is the papacy. Papacy comes out of Rome, It's different. It changes times and seasons. It tramples down the saints. And of course, the papacy in its heyday was very much like these powers and carried forth a lot of the wickedness that's described here. But the question is it the little horn that's predicted and prophesied here? And the answer is almost certainly not. Once again, this is something that was right then. And as a matter of fact, Daniel says that the little horn is destroyed and its dominion is taken away when Jesus comes. So this has to be something that stops now. Well, Calvin says it's the Roman emperors. And this is how Calvin does it. Calvin says the beast is Rome. And the Romans went out and they started conquering the world long before there were any Roman emperors. Now, you know that, if you remember your history. The Roman generals, Scipio, that conquered Carthage, Scipio Africanus conquered Carthage, Scipio Asiaticus was conquering all over Greece and Asia Minor. They were bickering with Egypt. We'll look at some of that history when we get to chapter 11. Then there was the Roman Civil War with Marius and Sulla, but even while that was going on, the Romans continued to conquer. Then they had the triumvirates, Caesar, Pompey, and who was the third one? Cicero. There were several triumvirates long before there were any emperors. And Calvin says, well, the 10 horns are the 10 powers of Rome. You remember your Roman history, the Roman government was kind of like ours. It had a division of power. There were 2 consuls. They were elected for 1 year each. And there were quaestors, and there were praetors, and there were proconsuls, and there were senators. What else? There were all kinds of different powers in Rome. And if there was an emergency, then there was a dictator. And they would call up Cincinnatus to come from his plow and be absolute dictator for 6 months to defeat the enemy, and then he had to go home after 6 months. Everything reverted to normal. Had a very constitutional Republican kind of government with a distribution of powers. And like I say, they had 2 consuls. They got this from Sparta. The Spartans, you know, claimed to be descendants of Abraham. The Spartans wrote letters to the Jews and said, hey, you're our brothers, aren't you? And they had correspondence back and forth, and they made treaties with each other. The Spartans always had 2 kings to prevent the centralization of power in Sparta. The Romans were like the Spartans. They had 2 consuls. When all this broke down, these 10 powers, these 10 horns, then, says Calvin, the little horn is the emperor, who eats up 3 of the horns. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the Caesars, Julius Caesar, Octavian, or Augustus Caesar, and the rest of them, they gobbled up some of this power. They never took away all the power of the senators, at least not officially. They didn't take away all the powers of the praetors and the quaestors, but some of them they did. And so that's what Calvin makes it out to be. The emperors are the little horns. And then he would see the killing of Nero or someone else as the destruction of the dominion of Rome, but the extension of life is granted to them for a little period. That's plausible. I don't think it works quite as well because I think that there's a better candidate. And the better candidate is Herod the Great. Herod in the Herodian line. Why Herod? Well, when you first say Herod, people think, gee, Herod? Was he all that important? Well, he is in the Bible because he's the last descendant of Esau. And the Jacob and Esau theme runs all the way through the Bible. The whole book of Obadiah is written against Edom. We have a pattern in the Old Testament that every time the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by Gentile power, the Edomites came in afterwards to add to the destruction. Psalm 137 says that. Remember against Edom, who said, raise it to its very foundations, after the city had been sacked by the Babylonians. And Herod of Idumea, you see, you hear that, Idumea, or in Greek, Idumea, Edom. It's the same word. They are the Edomites. And this goes all through the Bible. The Amalekites in the Bible are Edomites. So the book of Esther is a Jacob and Esau story. Haman the Agagite, who was from Amalek, that's Jacob and Esau. This goes all the way back to Cain and Abel. It goes to Jacob and Esau. It goes through the whole Bible. Then you come down to the New Testament and Jesus is put on trial. He's tried by 3 courts. Jews, Herod, and Rome. Paul is put on trial. He's tried by 3 courts. Sanhedrin, Herod, and Festus the Roman procurator. They're always there together. Theologically, they correspond to the sanctuary, the land, and the world. The rebellion against God the Father in the sanctuary, The evil Sanhedrin in the church. Cain murdering Abel in the land, that's Herod and Esau versus Israel. And then the Sethites in the world context, that's the Romans. You have three contexts right from the beginning in Genesis. You have three types of perversion, three wicked types of kingdom: wicked church, wicked brotherhood, wicked world. Sanhedrin, Herod, Rome. Once you get that paradigm in mind, then when you read Daniel and Revelation and other passages, you begin to say, well, we've got apostate Jews here, and we've got the apostate world empire here. We almost expect, where are the Edomites? Because there's always this triumvirate of evil in the Bible. But if we're not alert to that, we don't see Herod as a possibility. Herod works real well. When we get to chapter 11, at the end, we'll see Herod matches real good with the willful king at the end of that chapter, who is the same as the little horn that's being described here. Philip Morrow was the first to really make a case for this in his book, The 70 Weeks in the Great Tribulation. There had been others before him who suggested it, and he came to it quite independently and then discovered that it had been suggested here and there before. I think it fits, because Herod was killed when Jesus was born. Herod was king of the Jews, and Jesus is king of the Jews. And so the replacement of Herod by Jesus works quite well. What else works well about this is that the little horn is the face of Rome that the Jews see. Think in the vision. In the vision, Daniel sees this monster and he doesn't see any face. All he sees is every now and then these horns shoot out and claws show up and feet there. He doesn't see the monster itself. Then he sees a face. And the face looks bigger than the other horns because it's nearer to him. Well, what's the face of Rome that appears to the Jews? Who represents Rome to the Jews? Who is the Roman power that is over Israel? It's Herod. Did the Herods eat up three of the kingdoms? Well, yeah, they did. Three meaning several. Herod wound up with dominion over Edom and Judea and Samaria and Galilee and Iturea and other areas. Different provinces, Syria, different provinces of the Roman Empire were given to him. The Herods in the New Testament continue to be a major problem. Herod the Great, of course, tries to kill Jesus just before he's born. We'll see. I think that's predicted right here in this chapter. And Herod Antipas kills Herod. The next Herod kills James and tries to kill Peter. And the next Herod puts Paul on trial. So the Herods are prominent in the Bible, the Herodian line. But by AD 70, they were gone. And by the time Jesus was king, Herod had been defeated. Interesting also to look in the Gospels and see how Jesus treats Pilate and how he treats Herod. He treats Pilate with some respect. With Herod, he treats with no respect. When the Romans say, pay your taxes, Jesus goes out and gets a fish and gives the money to the Roman government. When he hears that Herod is saying things about him, he says, go tell that fox. I mean, he's quite openly contemptuous of Herod. It's as if Herod's power has already been broken by that point. But Rome's power should be respected because they're the ones that God has put over. There's a lot here, and we don't have time to go into all of it. I want to suggest this to you. In my preliminary commentary on Daniel back there, I give a good deal more information about this. So if you want more, you can read it. For now, let's continue to look at this chapter here and try to get the rest of it out. Makes sense to me that it's Herod. Now we come to the Son of Man. Someone like the Son of Man. The reason I think that it's like the Son of Man is that although this is Jesus, it is also the saints of the Most High. We are in union with Him. When He comes to the Father, we come with Him. We are seated with Him in the heavenlies. We rule with Him. Therefore, when the kingdom is given to Him, that's the same as giving the kingdom to us. I don't think we have two events here. That first the Son of Man receives the kingdom, and then the saints receive the kingdom. It would seem that one like the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days is a picture of Christ and the saints receiving the kingdom. The passage does not seem to make a distinction as if there were two events. Rather, the coming of the Son of Man to receive the kingdom is explained as the saints of the highest ones receiving the kingdom. Now, I say this because there's all this debate, you see. Well, does the Son of Man represent the believers getting the kingdom? Or does it represent Jesus getting the kingdom? And the answer is yes. It represents both, obviously. In Christ, we receive the kingdom, and there's no need to try to divide that up or do what liberal scholars, there are books and articles and bibliography on this is endless as they go back and forth, debating on whether it means the saints receive it or Jesus receives it. It's obviously both. The whole doctrine of union with Christ kind of settles it. What's the Son of Man? Son of Man is the second Adam. That's all. That's all that term means. Eve was told that she'd have a son, and he would be the one who would crush the head of the serpent and be King of Kings. And that's who this is, the second Adam, Son of Man. Now, if you expand that out in the Old Testament, you'll find that the image of the second Adam is a priestly image. The high priest is an image of the second Adam. He's the Son of Man. The king, messianic anointed king, is an image of the second Adam. He's the Son of Man. The prophets are images of the second Adam. They're the Son of Man. So that there are lots of sons of man in the Old Testament. And the idea of sonship comes up. Solomon is the son of David, and so forth. One could explore this quite a bit. But I think at its simplest level, it's Adam number 2, son of Adam. In terms of Daniel, when this happens in Daniel, it happens about 30 years after Ezekiel's prophecies. And if we go back to Ezekiel, we find that Ezekiel at the age of 30 is anointed to be high priest of Israel in exile. He's standing by the river and he sees the chariot, and the chariot comes down right next to him, and the hand of God is put on him, and all of a sudden Ezekiel is addressed as the Son of Man. Son of Man, stand on your feet. The Spirit entered me and set me on my feet. Son of Man, I'm sending you against the house of Israel, because they're stubborn and they won't listen to you. Son of Man, eat what you find. Ezekiel is the Son of Man. Now, I'll tell you something. When Daniel sees something like the Son of Man and he goes and tells his friends, I saw something like the Son of Man, they would have thought of Ezekiel immediately, because they were all reading Ezekiel. It was the latest thing. This was the book that was on the charts. I mean, Jeremiah had been published years before. He was gone. That was yesterday's news. Ezekiel was the current book. Ezekiel was still alive. Ezekiel is called Son of Man about 150 times in the book of Ezekiel. So when Daniel says, I saw someone like a Son of Man, he says, I saw someone like Ezekiel. You just paraphrase it. I saw somebody like Ezekiel coming up to the Ancient of Days. Well, what about Ezekiel? Well, Ezekiel is a major type of Christ, and that's why this works so well. He's anointed at the age of 30. He's a priest. He's taken into the chariot, and of course he's called Son of Man. The Spirit comes into him. We know he's a high priest because when his wife dies, he's not allowed to mourn. And that's only true of the high priest. Ezekiel destroys Jerusalem. He says that in chapter 43. Ezekiel 43, verse 3. He sees the glory of God coming back into the restoration temple, and he says, it was like the appearance of the vision that I saw when I came to destroy the city. If you read Ezekiel chapters 8 through 11, you'll see a man pouring fire on the city, and a man going through with a sword, killing people in the city. Ezekiel says, that was me. I was seeing myself. What does that mean? It means that Ezekiel's prophecies had something to do with bringing judgment on Jerusalem. After Jerusalem is destroyed, Ezekiel sends out letters to everybody else, all the other kingdoms, telling them that they're next. And then Ezekiel sees the people coming back into the land and gets the vision of the temple. Now that's all the stuff Jesus does. Jesus comes, he's baptized by the river at the age of 30. He's the Son of Man. He proclaims the destruction of Jerusalem. He sends the gospel out to the Gentiles. He builds the new kingdom of God, the new temple, the new church. Ezekiel, then, is a major picture of what the Son of Man is like. And so to say that someone like Ezekiel came to the Ancient of Days makes perfect sense. And that's what is happening here. So, in immediate context, it's someone like Ezekiel. In broader context, it's the second Adam. It's everything that's ever been said in the Old Testament about a new Adam coming and receiving the kingdom. And it's Jesus and it's us. And he receives the dominion that was given to the beasts. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar says, 70 years are appointed for Babylon. From now on, they have dominion. And the Persians have dominion, and the Greeks have dominion, and the Romans have dominion. And now that block of dominion is given to the one who's like a son of man. It's given to Jesus and to the saints. So, now we come down to the little horn again, because Daniel is distressed and alarmed. I think he's basically distressed and alarmed because what he sees is that the evangelistic work of the saints is what's causing these monsters to come out of the sea. But he also wants to know about the little horn. This is the second little horn, the Roman little horn. Tomorrow in Daniel 8 we'll find that there's also a little horn that comes out of Greece, and that's Antiochus Epiphanes. But this is the second little horn, the little horn that comes out of Rome. We're told more details about that in verse 24. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings or kingdoms will arise. And see, I don't think that works with Calvin's interpretation. He says that just means all the various distributed powers in the Roman Constitution, the Roman Republican government. But really it seems to refer to geographical areas. And to say that Herod took over several geographical areas makes sense. 10, I think, just means many. 3 means several. He will take 3 of the geographical areas and have dominion over them. And then it says in verse 25, words he will speak against the Most High, and the saints of the highest he will oppress. And then that's explained by the words against the Most High are, he will try to change set times and decree, and the oppression of the saints of the highest is explained by, they will be given into his hand for time, times, and half a time. So what does this mean? Changing times and law is what your Bible probably says. Problem is there's several different words for time in Daniel, and they have specific meanings. This means set times, and it is explained in verse 22 of Daniel 7 in context. Until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the set time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. What the little horn tries to prevent is that set time. He tries to prevent the coming of the Messiah and the giving of the kingdom to the saints. That, in context, is what he means by changing time. It doesn't mean he tries to change the religious calendar of Israel or something like that. It would be a different word. It would be the word for Moed, festival times. Here it is different. It means set times, and in context it's the same word in verse 22. He tries to prevent the Messiah from being born. He tries to prevent that from happening. So that's parallel to the idea of a decree. Your Bible says he wants to make alterations in times and in law. If the word for law was Torah, it would mean he was trying to change the standards of God's law. But it's not that word. It's not the Aramaic equivalent of that word. It's a word that means God's decree. And we have decrees all through here. Remember the decree of the angelic watcher, that Nebuchadnezzar would be a beast for a while. The decree of the hand writing on the wall, that the time was up for Babylon. Well, the decree is that the kingdom is given to the saints of the Most High. The decree is what we've just finished reading. The court sat, the books were open, the Son of Man came, and the decree is, you are given a kingdom, nations, peoples, men of every language, it will serve you forever. That's the decree. And that is what he's trying to change, in context. So, that is not so hard. Once you look at the original language here, the English is nebulous enough to where you might think, well, what does this mean? He wants to change the Jewish calendar and he wants to change the Torah. No, he wants to prevent the coming of Christ. The set time and the decree. Well, Herod did that. As soon as he heard the Messiah might have been born, he tried to kill him. That's a very self-conscious act. Herod pretended to be a devout Jew. He always went to the temple. He went to religious meetings. He knew the Bible inside and out because he was always being educated and he didn't obey any of it, but he went through the external motions. He knew about it. And when they came and said, a baby's been born in Jerusalem, that's the Messiah, and we've got signs in the sky that are telling us that it's so, and the Gentile believers from Persia have come over here to visit him, Herod said, well, that's who it is, all right, and he tried to kill him. That is the event that fulfills this, an attempt to prevent the coming of the kingdom. Self-conscious attempt to prevent the coming of the kingdom. I can say just a little bit more about Herod and the oppression of the saints. I have some notes on that. Let me give you that. That's the speaking against the Most High. That is, he puts his words against God's decree, and making changes in set times and decrees is what we've just looked at. Now we come to wearing down the saints of the Most High, or oppressing them, and the saints being given into his hand for a period of time. What is the suppression of the saints? Well, focally, the oppression of the saints of the Most High would be seen in the fact that Herod drove Jesus and his family into Egypt. So they were oppressed and had to leave the Holy Land. They were threatened. But in a larger compass, Herod, though he tried to mollify the Jews and present himself as a good ruler, was in fact so vicious and unstable that he was one of the most oppressive rulers in all of history. Josephus tells us that on one occasion he wiped out the entire Sanhedrin, sparing only one of them. That's in the Antiquities, although modern scholars who are pro-Herod often deny this. He murdered Hyrcanus, the mild-mannered high priest. Now let's get this down. He murders the high priest on one occasion. He murders the entire Sanhedrin on one occasion, except for one man. When Herod neared death, a group of young Jews tore down the golden eagle that Herod had placed over the great gate of the temple. Herod had sought to honor the Romans by putting a Roman eagle on the gate of the temple, which was an idol, and of course the Pharisees and the devout Jews couldn't stand this, and so when they heard he was on his deathbed, a bunch of students tore it down. Herod had them burned alive. Now Herod realized that no one would mourn his death, and so Herod ordered all the notable Jews in the kingdom to come and visit him. And when he did, he captured them all and locked them up in the Hippodrome, which was a coliseum he built for sports there. And he ordered that when he died, they should all be killed. That way the nation would go into mourning. Happily, once he died, they didn't kill all these guys. But that's Herod, okay? You want to talk about oppressing the saints, oppressing the people of God one way or the other. Focally, his oppression of the Christ child. More broadly, all these other horrible things he tried to do. Now, what about this time, times, and half a time? The common interpretation of that phrase, time, times, and half a time, is it means 3.5. That's very doubtful. The reason is, apparently, and I am not a Hebraist and certainly not an Aramaicist, but apparently the word times is capable of taking a dual as well as a plural form. And that means it could say a pair of times or more than a pair of times. We have good, better, best in English. We say good. If we compare two things, they're better. If we compare three or more, we say one of them is best. In other languages, especially in ancient languages, they have a singular of a noun, a plural of a noun, and for many nouns also a dual. If you say two hands, you use the dual of the word hands. If you want to say they raised many hands, then you would say hands plural. If you wanted to say he put up both his hands, you'd say hands dual. If they want to raise one hand, you'd use one hand in the singular. Well, apparently this word time is capable of a dual, and so if it meant time and 2 times and a half a time, it would be dual. But it's not. It's plural. So it doesn't seem to mean 1 plus 2 plus a half for 3.5. It means time, and then more times, and then a half a time. It doesn't seem to work that way. Moreover, there doesn't seem to be any event on any interpretation that lasts 3.5 years. Beyond that is the fact that in Daniel 12, verse 7, we have this, and this is the problem with your English Bibles. Unless you had some type of an English Bible that kind of footnoted out in the margin all these subtle distinctions, you wouldn't get it. Verse 7 of chapter 12, speaking of the Greek time of history that we've just surveyed in chapter 11, I heard the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river as he raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven and swore by him who lives forever that would be a time, times, and half. Not half a time, just time, times, and a half. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. Now that's not so hard. This is a different word for time. Not just because it's Hebrew and the other's Aramaic, but it's not the same equivalent word. It's a word that means appointed times. And in Daniel 11, we actually can follow this out. The time spoken of here in chapter 12 is the Persian time. The times is the Greek time, and we have several of them here. We have Alexander, we have the War of the North and the South, and we have the career of Antiochus Epiphanes. That's several times. And then the half is the career of the willful king, which is cut off. So in terms of Daniel 11, the phrase appointed times and a half is explained in context, and it doesn't mean 3.5 years. It means the Persian time, the several Greek times, and then the willful king or Herod's time, which is cut off. But that's a different word for time. We go back here, it's not an appointed time and several appointed times and a half, it's just times and a half, which seems just to mean an extended period of time. Revelation chapter 12, verse 14, which we will look at when we consider the 70 weeks, also says times and half a time. It repeats the word time 3 times, and therefore is picked up from this, and also doesn't seem to mean 3 separate divisible units, but rather just an extension of time. An extension of time that's broken off. I think that's what this means. There's no other interpretation that really fits. It's kind of a matter of excluding everything else. There's nothing in Herod's career, or if you wanted to say it was Caesar or someone else, there's nothing in their career that you would say, well, this was the time, and then these were the times, and this is the half. That doesn't work. It doesn't mean 3.5, so it's not 3.5 years. That doesn't fit. It's not 35 years. That wouldn't fit. It just seems to be a time, an extension of time. It seems to last on, and then suddenly it's cut off, half a time. That seems to be the meaning of it. And the court sits for judgment, his dominion is taken away. That's it. And the saints of the Most High receive the kingdom. Now we come to the hard part. This has all been the easy part. Verses 11-12 of Daniel 7 says this: when the court sits, Daniel hears the little horn continually making noise and bragging. Of course, it's just a little horn, but it still thinks it's so important. He keeps speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and his body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but extension of life was given to them for an appointed period of time. So this is appointed time. But the dominion is taken away. So after the Christian era, the other beasts continue. What does that mean? It looked as if the first beast was replaced by the second, replaced by the third, and replaced by the fourth. And what does it mean that the beast was slain? It says, I kept looking until the beast was slain. If that means the fourth beast, we have to go all the way back to verse 7. But if it means the little horn, which is an extension of the beast, in context, that's what it looks more like it means. Verse 11, I kept looking because of the sound of the boasting words the horn was speaking, and the beast was slain. Now, if it means the horn was slain, this language is fluid. The horn is an extension of the beast. He's not like the beast. He's Edomite, but he is coming up from the beast, has the power of the beast. The Herods really were. Herod the Great was wiped out right after Jesus was born. And the Herods, as a line, were gone by the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Jacob and Esau were both taken off the scene at the same time, it seems. Meanwhile, the Gentile beasts continued on. What does it mean about the extension of dominion of these other beasts? Well, some help comes in Revelation 13. We get a little help. Revelation takes up where Daniel leaves off. Daniel, at the end of Daniel, is told to seal up the book. Daniel says to the angel, he says, well, what happens next? And the angel says, seal the book. I'm not going to tell you anything about what happens next. This is it. Everything else is sealed up. So he seals up the book. We get to the book of Revelation. Jesus takes the book. He breaks open the seals, and we move on. Now, that's the way the two relate to each other. So Daniel doesn't say anything after the coming of Christ. Revelation takes it up, and it seems to take it up right here in a sense. Chapter 13, the Roman beast. Only now we can see the beast. We move forward in history enough to where now it's not just this beast that's all we see are horns and feet and claws. Now we can get a closer look because we know who it is. Chapter 13, the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea, Gentile sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. Oh, now we see it has 7 heads. And on the horns were 10 crowns, and on the heads were blasphemous names. And the beast I saw was like a leopard, His feet were like those of a bear. His mouth was like the mouth of a lion. Aha! So the lion and the bear and the leopard are all continuing their life in the Roman beast. So there's an extension of life granted to them. They're accumulating together. Then I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and the fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed, the whole land, the land of Judah. Now, land and sea in Revelation is Jew and Gentile. The land, the Jews were amazed, the apostate Jews were amazed and followed after the Roman beast. And they worshiped the dragon who was behind him. Well, what's the head that was slain and then was healed? Well, I know that in our circles we're used to saying that it had something to do with Nero or something like that. I suggest that it's Herod. Herod dies, his power is taken away, and yet the Herodians continue on. And they continue to be the Roman power in Palestine. It was the Herods who appointed the high priests. Remember, by the time we get now, the priesthood is so corrupt that it doesn't go down family lines. It's not only bought and sold from the existing power, but now the power is just appointed. And the Roman government told the Herods that they had the power to appoint the high priests. So if they had a high priest they didn't like, they'd take him out and appoint another one. So the Herods had the power. Herod the Great is killed rather horribly. He dies, his whole body rotted away. I mean, parts of his body rotted off. And then he finally died, Herod the Great. He tried to kill Jesus when he was a baby. But then there were more Herods after him. And I am tempted to think that the head, since this is the head that's visible, this little horn that becomes a head, it has eyes and a mouth, that's a head. It's the only head we see here, is the one that's composed of three horns that go into one horn and become a head with eyes and a mouth. That is slain. That looks like this one here. Revelation 17 says that the beast has 7 heads and there are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is yet to come. And then it says he also has an 8th head. Well, my guess is the 7 heads of the Roman emperors, and the 8th head somehow or other refers back to this unusual one, refers to the Herods. I sure don't have all this worked out, but I put it out on the table for you to think about. In some sense, the power of Rome is broken, and then there's an extension of life given to it. One thing's clear in the passage is that the dominion is taken away from the entire beast system, and then it's given to the man. 2 things kind of in conclusion here. One is beast and man. The Old Covenant is a time of animals. Adam was put in the garden with animals. We worship God through animal sacrifices. We learn about the world from studying the animals in Proverbs. That's true quite naturally. Tribes learn what they can eat and what they can't eat from animals. They learn where the water holes are by following animal tracks. Animals precede us in the world in the sense that they find what's good to eat and what's not. They find the water and make tracks that we follow. In the infancy of the human race, we learned a lot from the animals. That's quite true. And we dressed in animal skins. We worshipped through animal sacrifices. And the image of human life was animals. Some people are like lambs. Some people are like nice baby goats, and they're sacrificial. Others are like wild animals, and they're bad. And then when we come to the New Covenant, though, the imagery shifts to man. We worship through a man. Our sacrament is not to eat roast lamb, it's to eat Jesus. We eat human flesh in a mystery, in a symbol of the Lord's Supper. We come to the age of true humanism. And so, in the ancient world, the counterfeit of ancient religion was the totem pole with its animal faces and the animal idols. The counterfeit of Christian religion is to put up statues and icons in the church. Human faces. The Eastern Church and the Roman Church with their statues and their icons, that's counterfeiting the New Covenant. They violating the second commandment in a New Covenant way, whereas in the Old Testament, you violate the second commandment with animal faces. This is a real change in history here, and it's pointed to. The childhood of the human race, when we are still learning from the animals, we're living with the animals, we're in the garden, we're sacrificing animals, we're under dietary laws that tell us what animals we can eat and what we can't. All of that is much more part of life. The New Covenant, we're in the city, We live in a city, we're not around animals anymore. You live in a city. I've never milked a cow. I don't know how. I've never ridden a horse. I've grown up in a city. And history moves from garden to city. The more history moves into city form, the more distant we become from animals. We didn't evolve from animals, but we were there with them in the childhood of the race. And, of course, that's not to say we won't continue to be involved with animals, but it won't have the same place in our civilization. That's one large shift that's coming here. The second thing I'd like to comment on is the distress of Daniel and go back to the monsters coming out of the sea. I do think that a psychoanalytic interpretation of this passage, which I think is quite valid, points to something that's worth thinking about. The Bible tells us that human beings are made in the image of God, and since God is infinitely complex, we are infinitely complex. We're not God, but there's no limit to how far we can grow. You and I are going to live forever. In 1 trillion years from now, we'll be learning more things. Since God is infinite and we grow as we learn about Him, there's no limit to how much we can learn. So there's no limit to how much we can grow, and there's no limit to our potential. Eventually, you and I want to learn every language that there is, every language that ever exists, because every language is a slant on God. God is the Word, and God as the Word reveals Himself in all human languages, and yet each language is slightly different. You know that the definition of an educated man used to be somebody who knows a foreign language. Because if you don't know a foreign language, you can only think one way. But as soon as you learn French or German or Chinese or something else, and if you learn it to where you think in it, that whole vocabulary, all those words and all their grammar and everything is slightly different from ours. You learn to think another way, which means that you're no longer culture bound. Now, that's why it used to be, to get a university degree, you had to really master at least one foreign language so that you could stand away from your culture and see things in a different light. Well, that's because every language is a slant on God. And the more languages you know, the more different ways you have of expressing this truth. So 1 trillion years from now, I hope that we will all know all the different languages there are, and we'll be able to think in all those different languages, and we'll have that many more different ways to think about and praise God. When we sing in English, we tend to sing hymns that are four square, because in English the accent's usually on the first syllable of a word, which means our music goes dun 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 dun. But in French, the accent's at the end of the word. So the French psalms have a completely different rhythmic feel to them than the English psalms do. That's because they're French. The rhythm and music of that language is different. Well, we'd like to learn to praise God in all those languages, and we will. And someday you'll be playing the violin. And someday you'll be designing architecture. And someday you'll be creating stars out of raw material out in space. There's no limit to what we will do as we grow and grow and grow forever and ever, because we're infinite. And we'll learn more and more and more about ourselves. Now, what does that mean for sin? Sin goes all the way down. And that's why when we confess sin, we have to confess that we sin in ways that we cannot understand, because there are depths of wickedness in us that we don't understand, and that if we lived 1,000,000 years, we would only be beginning to understand. Paul says in Romans 7, I can't even understand myself here. When I seek to do good, that's when evil arises in me. In other words, we have a subconscious aspect to our minds, and you and I are only 30 or 40 or 50 years old. That's not very long. We don't understand very much about ourselves. And so, some of you are even younger than that. You don't know much about yourself. There's a vast reservoir of the subconscious in us. Now, that's not something that you have to be afraid to say, that it's as if it comes from Freud or something. It's a teaching of the Bible. The Bible calls it the flesh. The flesh is what's down there inside of us. Now, as regenerated human beings, our hearts are regenerated, but between our hearts and our heads, there's all this flesh that gets in the way. That's the image. And the flesh is deceptive. If you think you can confess all your known sins and deal with yourself, you're crazy. You can't confess all your known sins. You don't know what they are. To confess some, if God brings a sin to mind, confess it, deal with it, and be grateful that He's faithful and just to cleanse us from all unrighteousness if we confess the ones we know. what I'm leading up to is that there are subconscious monsters in our flesh. There are monsters in the id. The human race and human beings have incredible potential that is not tapped. And in paganism, that potential just sits there. If you know anything about pagan life, now paleo-pagans now, I don't mean pagan Americans now, but paleo-pagans, you know, your real pagan, living in the woods, they really do just live this kind of happy, simple lifestyle. Now, it's not to say that they don't kill each other and murder each other, but everything is kind of secure in their life because they've got an uncomplicated life. And all of these potentials are not there. And one thing is true of pagans, they have no self-doubt and no self-reflection. They never examine themselves to say, am I doing right or wrong here? That makes no sense to a primitive Greek or a primitive African or a primitive American. And increasingly makes no sense to kids in the United States today who've grown up thinking they've never done anything wrong. Now, if you look at the Psalms are full of self-doubt. And when Christianity comes into the Roman world, initially you've got a lot of theologians running around who have no self-doubt, and they're ready to persecute anybody who disagrees with them. And Cyril of Alexandria, who happened to be right, is ready to persecute anybody who disagrees with him. But after a course of time, you come to Augustine, and Augustine writes a whole book where he says, man, am I doing right or am I doing wrong? The Confessions of St. Augustine are the first great psychoanalytical self-examination that comes out of the gospel, as the gospel begins to cause people to be aware of what's inside of themselves. As they become more aware of God, they become more aware of themselves. And they become more questioning of themselves. And there's more self-doubt. Am I doing right or am I doing wrong? And the more self-doubt you get, the more you need the doctrine of justification, which says, my security is not in me, but it's in Christ alone. So after Augustine programmed civilization with self-doubt, you've got to have Luther who comes along and says, I can't trust myself at all. I've got to have external righteousness. Now, this is the course of history. This is a psychoanalysis of history that is a result of the gospel. The gospel stirs up what's inside of people. And from a Christian standpoint, it makes us doubt ourselves, question ourselves, which we need to do. Makes us trust God more and more. It also releases energy. So when Christianity comes, civilization suddenly becomes possible. Energy comes out. Scientific discoveries take place. Over the course of time, people say, I think I'll go and explore this place instead of just living here in the tribe forever and ever. Let's go out and look it over here. Let's not do things the way we've always done them. All of that starts to happen, and it only happens when the gospel comes, because it starts to release this potential that's in man. Man, being the image of God, has incredible potential, but it's just dormant and kept down in paganism. It's kept under governors and rulers under the old covenant in the archaic world until the gospel comes to start releasing it. But what happens when the gospel comes? When the gospel comes into a culture, the first thing it does is it shatters that culture. Things fall apart. The Spirit releases the potential in humanity, and the first thing that happens is the gospel produces monsters. It always has. Because the gospel comes in, the Holy Spirit comes in, and a whole lot of human potential is released, a whole lot of energy becomes available, but there's not a whole lot of sanctification. And there's not a whole lot of percentage of Christians. So the first thing that happens is monsters are produced. Now we see this in our own history. The missionary movement went all over the third world in Africa 150 years ago, and what did it produce? It produced communism. All over the third world in Asia and Africa and everywhere else, the gospel shattered those old conventional ways of life that were going nowhere, released a whole bunch of potential, but the immediate result, although there were Christians sanctified in it, but when you look at it externally, what you see is political power becomes a possibility, people start being educated, and it produces monsters. Then it produces men. The history of the early church is kind of the same way, and the history of Europe is kind of the same way. The gospel releases this potential. It calls forth what's inside a man.
And what's inside of us are monsters. Lions, bear-like things, horrible beasts. They're released when the four winds of heaven start to stir up the sea. You know, the discriminating applicatory preaching stirs you up. If you hear a discriminating applicatory sermon, you may go out mad at the preacher. It stirs up what's inside. In a foul mood, you may go home and beat somebody up because the preacher preached something you didn't want to hear. It has that initial effect. Then, the thrones are set up and judgments passed on behalf of the saints of the Most High, and the beasts are killed. What does that mean? Well, this is why this is necessary. In order for the human race to go and be sanctified, you've got to call these monsters out so they can be killed. If you don't call the monsters out, you can't kill them. If you just leave them there, and the pagan world is just fat, dumb, and happy forever and ever, the daughter of God never grows up to be the bride of Christ. We don't mature as a human race. We don't mature as individuals. So the gospel has to come, the Word of God has to come, and it has to stir up the monsters from the id, from the subconscious, whatever that is, not the Freudian id, but the subconscious of the human race, becomes more self-conscious, becomes epistemologically self-conscious more and more. They have to be produced so they can be slain. And that's the order here. The gospel stirs up the Gentile world, and the Gentile world reacts, and then the monsters are killed. See it in Esther. The witness, both true and false, of the Jews stirred up resentment. See, when Haman the Agagite said, let's wipe out the Jews because of Mordecai's bad witness, there were a whole lot of people who were ready to say, yeah, let's kill a Jew because they had been offended. But then, what happened? In Esther, on the appointed day, all the Jew killers came out in the street, but the Jews were able to kill them. Now, the nice thing about that was this exposed all the Jew killers so they could be killed. If we hadn't gone through that, those Jew killers would have been out there generation after generation. But because of this event, and of course the Jews at that time were the people of God, those who hate the people of God exposed themselves and then were defeated. What preaching does is exposes our sin so we can mortify it. Culturally, what the gospel does is it brings up the monsters so they can be killed. And you look in the New Testament and you find the gospel mystery comes forth, and what comes forth right at the same time? The mystery of iniquity. The veil of the temple is rent, the ark of the covenant is open, the law goes forth, Jesus is on the throne. What happens at the same time? The ephah is opened up from Zechariah, and the woman of wickedness gets out and rides on the back of the beast, so that she and the beast can be slain. But before they get slain, they kill a lot of the saints. The gospel brings forth the beast so the beast can be slain. I think that's the largest picture that's here. I think that's why it says that the four winds of heaven, the evangelistic work of the saints, are what stirs these things up. And they are threats. I mean, the lion with wings of an eagle is really a bad thing until it's converted and it stands on its feet like a man. It becomes like the Son of Man who is coming, you see. These are not neutral beasts. These are threatening beasts. And the horn that is the face of the fourth beast, that's a great threat. And it actually moves against the saints, but then it's killed. And Daniel is distressed, and I think he's distressed because what he's seeing is just the witness of the saints that sets all this in motion. And that's really kind of new in history. Up till this time in the Bible, we haven't seen this. We haven't had this age of witness bearing, this age of stirring things up. It's not been seen before. This is new. Daniel is the transitional book where we begin to see for the first time people persecuted precisely for their faith, and we'll see this theme continue in Daniel. So, that's Daniel 7. As I see it, best I can do with it, put stuff on the table. It's pretty late. We can discuss it for a few minutes if you want, or we can save it for discussion times tomorrow.
One quick question. In the verse 25, it says, "You set times plural." From what your interpretation of it didn't seem to account for the plural there.
No, I didn't account for the plural. It's just a plural, Majesty. No, I didn't account for the plural. It might be that there's more than one set time. I'm quite comfortable saying that it alludes first and primarily to the set time in verse 22 in context where the saints take possession of the kingdom. But there may be other aspects of that I didn't see. But you're right, it is plural. Verse 25. You will make alterations in set times, plural, and the decree.
It's been a while since I've read anything in Revelation. Is the relationship to that the 1260 days.
I'm going to come to that, I hope. Dealing with Daniel's 70 weeks, the last half of the 70th week, which I think is there in Revelation 12 and also in Acts 1 through 10. So I'm going to try to go into that some.
Back when you were talking about time and half time, could you summarize that briefly as far as your dual? I didn't follow that.
Didn't you go to seminary?
I don't know. I know what you're saying, but then that still comes up with 3.5. The time, which is dual, and then a half.
Yeah, but it's not dual.
It's not dual, it's plural.
Yeah, see, the times there is not dual, it's plural. It should be dual if it meant 2 times. If it was 1 time, 2 times, and a half a time, it should be in the dual form. But it's not, it's in the plural form. It's im rather than ayin. Now, you could come back and say, yeah, but this word, this is one of the many words that doesn't have a dual. It just has singular and plural. But apparently, here's an Aramaic scholar, Isbel, and that's his whole point in his article in the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. He says it's not dual, and he's an Aramaicist, so apparently it could be dual. The word is capable of being dual, and if that's the case, then it should be dual if this meant 2 times. That's my point.
So, but if he said it is not dual.
It's not dual, it's plural, therefore it can't mean 1 time, 2 times, and a half a time. That's his argument. It has to mean 1 time, a bunch of times, and a half a time. So that eliminates the 3.5.
So there is something to this human potential movement in some strange way.
All of these things like human potential movement are just perversions of the gospel. That secular humanism is a perversion of the gospel. In paganism there is no humanism. The image of man in paganism is always an animal. If you're in the wolf tribe, you want to be like a wolf, do the wolf dance. You don't try to be like a man. Well, secular humanism is a perversion of Christian humanism, the true humanity of the Son of Man, and we try to be like Him. In the sacrament, we eat Him to become more like Him. In the gospel, we hear His words to become more like Him. So our image as a man, secular humanism, counterfeits that. Now, it actually starts in Greece. Remember, the Restoration era is the anticipation, and the Greeks made a break and started having an image of man to copy from. So the anticipation of that perversion is in Greece, but in all earlier forms of paganism, and in paganism as it continues today in tribes around the world, the image is always animals and not man. The whole Freudian psychoanalytical development of saying there's a subconscious or an unconscious in man, that comes out of Augustine. That's a perversion of the Christian, of the Puritans. The Puritans were great soul doctors and curates of souls, and many of the medieval doctors were as well, and all of that is a secular distortion and actually a great simplification of the amazingly complex view of humanity that the Church had developed.